I'm transferring my track plan onto the Benchwork for my new layout expansion on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure to subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Well, I've been working on an expansion to my layout. And in recent videos, you've seen how I've built the support wall that's going to support both decks of this expansion, and you watched me build the benchwork for the lower deck of this expansion. Now, this lower deck is going to be the most involved piece of the expansion. It's going to be basically one large switching industrial area that represents Saginaw, Texas, where the upper deck, when we get to it, it's going to be more open country scenery. So today I'm going to be transferring my track plan onto the benchwork in preparation for laying track and also continuing on into the helix that will connect these two decks. So today we're going to be transferring that track plan from the paper to the benchwork, making sure that we get everything in just the right location. Check out our sponsor, Midwest Model Railroad. With some of the best prices and customer service in the business, they're your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com. Link in the description. Now, as we get started, I want to show you some of the things that I have on hand that I think make this process of getting everything transferred just much easier. First of all, I have printed out a copy of my track plan. Now, I didn't copy the entire track plan for the whole layout. Just need the section for this area where we're working. So literally what I have here is this piece of bench work as it turns around into the existing layout. And we're going to be using that to help make sure that we have our measurements and our placement, everything just right. Obviously, to get that in the right place, I need a good tape measure. So I've got a tape measure and a pencil. I want to suggest, as you're doing this kind of work, where you're going to be adding scenery later, that you always work in pencil. Now, I see people from time to time work with ink pens on wood and sometimes even Sharpies. I strongly do not recommend that. This is coming from my own personal experience. On a previous layout, I had a section of the layout where I marked some things with some red Sharpie. Later, as I went back to add scenery, I used an alcohol mixture for wet water to make sure that my glue could soak in, and that alcohol pulled that red Sharpie ink all the way up through cork, through my ballast, so that I literally had red spots on my layout. You do not want that. I strongly suggest it's always been suggested that anytime you're doing woodwork anyway, pencil is your ideal marking tool, and in this case I really suggest that so that you don't have that kind of an issue. I have some straight edges here. In this case I've got an aluminum yardstick, 3 foot or approximately 1 meter straight edge, and I've also got an 18-inch metal straight edge here as well. This is just a homemade compass, and I'll show you more about that a little bit later, but this is going to help us in getting our curves and making sure that we get our curve radius right. And then I think it's ideal when you're laying out a track plan to have some track on hand. Now, I've gone ahead and purchased I think all of the track and the turnouts that I'm going to need for both levels of this expansion. I don't need to lay all of those out, but it is handy to have a couple left-hand and a couple right-hand turnouts and a few joints of track, just so you can kind of lay those things out and get a sense for how they're going to look. One other item I don't have here in the camera shot, but one other item that I'm going to be using is going to be a chalk line for helping me to make a reference grid here on my bench work. And of course, you can't do any real work on a model railroad without a cup of coffee. I'm going to begin the process of laying the track plan out here in this corner. Just to give you a reference, to the left over here is the existing layout, and there's a tangent track, a straight track that'll be coming up here into the corner. Off behind the camera, of course, is the bulk of the expansion part of this particular deck, and there'll be a straight track for the main line coming up along here. And then here we're going to have a curve. And this curve, in some ways, is kind of the anchor point for all of the rest of this track plan for this section of the layout because I want this curve to be in the correct radius and I want it to be in the correct position. So in order to do that, I need to begin by getting my main line tangent drawn in on both sides of this curve so I can get the curve drawn in. Now, in order to get all of those things in place, I want to make a little bit of a grid on my my new benchwork here. Again, this is a kind of a plywood laminate style benchwork, so I can literally just draw a grid out on this and use that for reference. Now, I don't need a real tight grid on my track plan. I have like a 2-inch grid. I don't need that, but I can draw about a 6-inch grid so I have something to measure off of to help me make sure that I have my everything in place. One of the things that you're going to notice that I'm going to be doing is, I'll pull this down here. I've got this 1x4, long 1x4 that's going to be back against the wall, and then another shorter piece of 1x4 that I'm going to put against it. And I'm going to use those as spacers for reference because, and you'll see this in later video as we get towards the upper deck, there are going to be a couple of layers of laminate on top of these studs in order to help me to be able to mount the shelf brackets. They're going to hold the upper deck in place, and also something to help me mount the backdrop to for this part of the layout. That'll all be clear whenever we do that. Again, that'll be in a later video. But just understand, you're going to see me using these spacers and measuring off of them, and that's the reason why, because I need basically 1.5 inches or 2 thicknesses of 1x to get my spacing right, because there's going to be that much space behind the backdrop for this part of the layout. I've also got this little scrap of plywood here. I have this little hole in the benchwork, which ultimately is just going to be covered with foam, and for the sake of being able to contour that for scenery. But the center point of the radius of my curve is right in this hole. So I'm gonna be just temporarily screwing this piece of plywood in place so that I can have a center point to reference my curve as we get ready to draw that, and then later we'll be coming back and taking that out. To create a reference grid on the benchwork, I measured 6-inch increments from the backdrop at each end and then snapped a chalk line on each one. I then measured every 12 inches from the end of the benchwork and made a reference line using a framing square. Comparing measurements from my printed track plan grid to these reference lines will help me get my track placement right. Well, now that I have the grid laid out on the new section of benchwork, I'm ready to start marking out some track lines. Now, I'm going to be using that grid as my reference point because the studs along the stud wall that support the benchwork may not all perfectly be exactly in place. They can have a tendency to have some warps and twists in them. I'll get a more consistent measurement if I measure off of the grid because I've made sure to mark it in nice straight lines. So we'll be using that to mark off, and we're going to start by drawing out our main line. So let's get started. I measured the placement of my main line from the reference grid that I had just drawn by marking its place every few inches, then using a straight edge to draw in the line. I then labeled the main in a couple of places so I could easily identify which line was which as I continued. I repeated the same process to draw the main line placement as it extends out from the existing track on the layout. The anchor point for this section of the layout will be the main line curve in the corner between the existing layout and the new section. This is an 18-inch radius curve with transition curves or easements at each end. I made a detailed video about laying out curves just like this with easements some time ago. If you want to see in detail how to do this, follow the link in the corner of your screen right now, or you can watch it after this video is finished. I used a framing square to identify the center of the continuous radius portion of the curve and the start and end points where the curve meets the tangent track on each end. Now that I have the center point marked for my radius, adjusting for the offset so that I can get my my easement or transition curve in. Now it's time to use my little homemade compass, and this is literally just it's a nice straight edge of a board that I ripped off at some point in the past, and it's got a series of holes drilled in it. And out here on the edge, I've got them marked 16 inches, 18 inches, and 20 inches, and those are distances from this point here. Now, if I was out in a clear, I'd draw my a screw through this, make this the pivot point. I could just put my pencil in these areas. But since I'm kind of limited on space here, I'll actually put the screw through here, the 18-inch mark. I'll mark my arc. That will be the constant radius part of my curve. And then we'll be ready to start laying out the easement or the transition curve. And there I have my arc drawn out for the constant radius portion of my curve. You'll notice I made the arc past where I needed the end to be. I want to make sure I got plenty of arc drawn on there to make sure I've got lots of room. And now we're ready to start drawing in our transition curve or our easements. I use the bent stick method for drawing easements. In this case, I'm using a joint of 3/16 inch wooden dowel rod. Since I'm working alone, I use a few screws on each side of the dowel to hold it straight along the tangent on the end of the curve. I bend the dowel until it matches up with the fixed radius curve at and beyond the easement point. Again, all of this process is explained in full detail in that video on laying curves that I mentioned before. I repeat this same process on both ends of the curve. With the curve drawn, I use an eraser to lighten the unwanted excess lines. With the basic main line drawn, I next drew the industrial siding. Starting at the switch at the end of the existing layout, I spaced the lead 1 1/4 inches from the main line. 1 1/4 inches will be the typical spacing between the tracks in this industrial section. In N-scale, that comes out to about 16.5 scale feet. I used a straight edge to draw the straight track and used reference marks to freehand the curve at the same spacing from the main line. I continued this process down the length of the new section of the layout. I measured where the beginning of the curve on the main line into the helix will be. As long as I know where this curve begins, I can work around it for now and draw it in later. Next, I started marking the placement of turnouts. The first turnout out of the helix will lead to a 2-track staging yard for intermodal trains on the other side of the wall. Beyond that turnout will be one that leads into the siding for the large ADM grain elevator. This will be a keystone structure on the expansion, as it is 5 feet long along the backdrop. I then marked the turnouts on the other end of this siding. At the east end, it will be a crossover, as the siding will extend further down the benchwork to facilitate loading of grain cars in the facility. At the west end, there will be a crossover between the main and the primary industrial lead. This will allow for runaround moves and add flexibility as the lead continues on into an industry at the end of the benchwork. Finally, it was time to lay out the industrial trackage. The first two industries, Quality Carriers and Koch Industries, share a common spur just as they do on the prototype. Each of these industries has two tracks that connect to that spur. Some of these short curves I freehanded for the time being. I'll check and correct the curvature when I lay down the cork roadbed later. The third industry along the front of the layout is Fort Worth Pipe Company. It also has two tracks off the main industrial lead, but the second track is spaced farther away as it leads into the main structure of the facility, carrying coil steel cars inside, while the first track runs behind the structure to a yard on the far side where pipe is loaded onto flat cars and gondolas. The hashed line represents the trackage inside of the facility. The last industry along the new section of the lower deck is Trinity Industries' railcar division. At the time that I modeled, this plant built air slide covered hoppers. For now, I'm drawing in two tracks in this facility, but I have plenty of room and plan to add more trackage and facilities here. I just haven't settled on the track arrangement yet. The final industry to be added is at the junction between the existing layout and the new section. It is the new location for Universal Forest Products. I am significantly expanding this facility. There's some unevenness between the new sub-roadbed and the old towards the front of the layout, but I'll even this out with some Sculptamold before I lay the tracks in this industry. Well, I am really glad to have the track plan transferred onto the lower level of the benchwork here, and I really like the way things are looking. I think the scene is going to come out just exactly like I had hoped when I planned it on paper to begin with. So I'm very excited about that. Now, I'm not ready to start laying track yet. I needed to get the track plan on so I can know exactly how to continue into the helix, which is the next building project. But I don't want to lay any track or even put down any cork roadbed until I get the backdrop on. And I can't get the backdrop installed until after I get the upper deck at least basically installed, so I know exactly where that backdrop needs to go. So it's going to be a little while before I'm ready to lay track, but it's still pretty exciting just to kind of mock things up and see what this scene is going to look like. Well, if you enjoyed this video, you'll want to check out the entire project, including the track plan and how I drew it up in AnyRail 6, how we built the benchwork, and the whole 9 yards. And you'll find all of that on a playlist in the link in the corner of your screen right now. Hey, be sure and check out the description down below where you'll find links to my Amazon page, my Amazon pick of the week, my MicroMark promo code that can save you 10% on regularly priced items at micromark.com, and tons of other great links that I know you'll enjoy and you'll benefit from as well. Well, if you'd like to see some more model railroad content right now, check out the links on your screen. And be sure to join me each Tuesday as I bring you even more great model railroad videos. And I look forward to seeing you then. 10, Lizzie?